What is the biggest human rights challenge facing Canada today? In answering the question, a good place to start is with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Sections of the Charter dealing with democracy and mobility start with the term every citizen of Canada. In contrast, sections dealing with fundamental and legal rights do not have this citizenship caveat. Instead, they start with the term everyone. There are no shortages of domestic human rights issues. However, in order to identify the biggest challenge to human rights, we must look beyond our borders to see how Canadian policies impact everyone, not just Canadian citizens. No policy has the ability to impact as many people or violate as wide a range of human rights as Canada's arms trade policy. Canadian-made arms have been exported to countries with a persistent record of human rights abuses. One in particular, Saudi Arabia, tops the list with almost 20% of all Canadian non-US arms exports. The Saudi regime has long been cited as a violator of humanitarian law and human rights. There is evidence that Canadian-made equipment has been used in Yemen and against the Saudi people. Despite this, Canada has approved a $15 billion arms deal to provide armored vehicles to the regime. Critics argue that it is illegal to provide arms to regimes with persistent records of human rights abuse. But is it? Surprisingly, there is nothing in legislation. The Export and Import Permits Act makes no mention of human rights analysis prior to arms export. The Global Affairs Canada Export Controls Handbook does make reference to it. It cites a 1986 ministerial directive which states that the government must closely control the export of military items to countries with a persistent record of serious violations of the human rights of its citizens. But it also allows for some pretty broad mitigation strategies, such as assurances from the importing state that they will not use them to commit human rights violations. So technically the government position is correct. It is legal. But being technically legal doesn't make it right. Admittedly, the government must balance interests. The defense industry in Canada is dependent on exports. Limiting exports based on a difficult to define criteria could result in the death of the industry, taking with it countless jobs and votes. The loss of a domestic defense industry would also have national security implications. From a geopolitical perspective, Saudi Arabia is seen as an ally against the greater threat posed by Iran. While valid points, are these concerns really enough to outweigh the human rights abuses that Canadian-made arms can, and already have, contributed to? Canadians like to imagine that we are defenders of human rights on the international stage. From peacekeeping to banning landmines, the defense of human rights on the global stage has become part of our identity. Yet in order to be world leaders, we must be beyond reproach. So how can it be addressed? Canada will soon join the UN Arms Trade Treaty, but even if it does, it will not change current practices. Remember those armored vehicles being sold to the Saudis? Canada is only supplying the hull. Belgium is providing the weapon systems. Like other EU countries, Belgium is not only a signatory of the ATT, they are also subject to the European Union Code of Conduct on Arms Exports. Both the ATT and EU allow for the same mitigation as current Canadian policy. Mitigating abuses through assurances has proven to be ineffective, and there is little recourse in the event that there is a breach. This is an area where Canada can take on a global leadership role. We can implement legislation that prevents Canadian companies, regardless of where they locate their manufacturing facilities in the world, from exporting to regimes with a persistent record of human rights violations. Taking this approach will have its costs. Strong leadership does not stem from making easy decisions. It comes from having the courage to make difficult decisions, aware of the costs, but willing to make them anyway, because it's the right thing to do. If we want our elected officials to point out violations of human rights, we need to be pointing with clean hands.